Roald Dahl's story Dip in the Pool takes place on a ship where the sea had been rough for the first 2 days but calmed on the third day. Passengers who had been hiding in their cabins came out onto the sun deck to enjoy the pleasant weather. The deck steward provided them with chairs and rugs to make them comfortable. The calm sea created a more pleasant atmosphere on the ship, and by evening, the passengers felt confident and relaxed. However, during dinner, they realized that the ship had started rolling again, causing a subtle change in mood. Some passengers looked up from their food, feeling nervous and apprehensive about the ship's movements. Some individuals remained calm and unaffected, while others displayed a smug attitude. Some of the smug individuals even made jokes about food and weather to torment those who were starting to experience discomfort. The ship's movement then became increasingly violent, and within a short span of 5 or 6 minutes after the initial roll was noticed, the ship began to sway heavily from side to side. Passengers held onto their chairs, bracing themselves against the force, similar to leaning in a car while taking a sharp turn. Eventually, a particularly severe roll occurred, causing Mr. William Bottyball, who was seated at the purser's table, to witness his plate of poached turbot with hollandaise sauce suddenly slide away from his fork. This caused a stir of excitement, with everyone reaching for their plates and wine glasses. Seated next to the purser, Mrs. Renshaw let out a small scream and grabbed onto the purser's arm. The purser, glancing at Mrs. Renshaw, remarked that it was going to be a stormy night. He seemed to take pleasure in saying that it was going to be a particularly rough night. A steward quickly approached and poured water on the tablecloth between the plates. The passengers calmed down and most of them continued eating. However, a few, including Mrs. Renshaw, cautiously got up and made their way through the tables and out the door. The purser remarked, "Well, there she goes," and looked approvingly at the remaining passengers who sat calmly, displaying their pride in being recognized as good sailors. After everyone finished eating and coffee was served, Mr. Bottyball, who had been unusually serious since the ship started rolling, suddenly stood up and brought his cup of coffee to Mrs. Renshaw's empty seat next to the purser. He sat down and immediately leaned over to whisper urgently in the purser's ear. "Excuse me," he said, "but could you tell me something, please?" The purser, a small, fat, and red-faced man, leaned in to listen. "What's the matter, Mr. Bottyball?" he asked. The man's face looked worried, and the purser watched it closely. "What I want to know is this," the man said anxiously. "Will the captain have already estimated today's distance for the auction pool before it started getting rough like this?" The purser, who was expecting a personal secret, smiled and leaned back in his seat to relax his full stomach. "Yes, I agree," he replied. He didn't bother to speak quietly, but instinctively lowered his voice as one would when responding to a whisper. "When do you think he did it?" "Probably sometime this afternoon. He usually does it in the afternoon." "What time do you think?" "Oh, I'm not sure. Around 4 o'clock, I would guess." "Now, let me ask you something else. How does the captain decide which number it will be? Does he put a lot of effort into that?" The purser looked at Mr. Bottyball's worried and furrowed face and smiled, understanding what he was getting at. "Well, you see, the captain has a small meeting with the navigating officer, and they analyze the weather and other factors, and then they make their calculation." Mr. Bottyball took a moment to think about the answer before responding. "Do you think the captain was aware of the bad weather today?" "I couldn't say," the purser replied, his eyes fixed on Mr. Bottyball's with a hint of excitement. "I really don't know, Mr. Bottyball. I wouldn't have any idea. If the weather gets worse, it might be worth buying some of the lower numbers. What do you think?" The whispering became more urgent and anxious. "Perhaps," the purser said. "I doubt the captain anticipated a rough night. It was quite calm this afternoon when he made his estimate." The others at the table fell silent, straining to hear, their expressions mirroring the intense focus seen at the racetrack when trying to overhear a trainer discussing their chances. Lips slightly parted, eyebrows raised, heads tilted to the side, a desperate, half-hypnotized, listening look that comes when hearing something directly from the source. "Now, if you were able to buy a number, which one would you choose today?" Mr. Bottyball whispered. "I don't know the range yet," the purser replied patiently. "They won't announce it until the auction starts after dinner. And I'm not very good at it anyway. I'm just the purser, you know." At that moment, Mr. Bottyball got up from his seat. "Excuse me, everyone," he said, and he carefully made his way across the unsteady floor between the other tables. He had to hold onto the back of a chair twice to steady himself against the ship's movement. He asked the elevator operator to take him to the sun deck. As he stepped out onto the open deck, the wind hit him directly in the face. He stumbled and grabbed onto the railing with both hands, holding on tightly. He stood there, observing the darkening sea where large waves were rising and white horses were riding against the wind, leaving trails of spray behind them. "The weather was pretty bad out there, wasn't it, sir?" the elevator operator asked as they descended. Mr. Bottyball was fixing his hair with a small red comb. "Do you think we have reduced our speed due to the weather?" he inquired. "Oh yes, sir. We have significantly slowed down since this started," the elevator operator replied. "In weather like this, you need to slow down the speed or else the passengers will be thrown around the ship." In the smoking room, people were already gathering for the auction. They were politely grouping themselves around the tables, with the men in their dinner jackets and the women with cool white arms. Mr. Bottyball sat close to the auctioneer's table, crossing his legs and folding his arms. He had a determined look on his face, as if he had made a big decision and refused to be scared. He estimated that the pool would be around $7,000, which was the same as the past 2 days. Since it was a British ship, they used pounds, but he preferred to think in dollars. $7,000 was a lot of money. He planned to ask for payment in $100 bills and keep it in the inside pocket of his jacket. There wouldn't be any problem with that. As soon as he got the money, he would buy a Lincoln convertible. He would pick it up on his way home from the ship and surprise his wife, Ethel, with it. Wouldn't it be interesting to see Ethel's reaction when he arrived at the door in a brand new light green Lincoln convertible? He would greet her casually, saying, "Hello, Ethel, honey. I just thought I'd get you a little present. I saw it in the window as I passed by, and I remembered how you always wanted one. Do you like it, honey? Do you like the color?" He would then observe her facial expression. The auctioneer was now standing behind his table. "Ladies and gentlemen," he exclaimed, "the captain has estimated that the day's journey, ending tomorrow at noon, will cover 515 miles. As usual, we will include the 10 numbers on either side to form the range. That makes it 505 to 525. And for those who believe the actual figure will be further away, there will be separate auctions for the low field and high field. Now, let's draw the first numbers from the hat. Here we go, 512. The room fell silent. The attendees remained seated, their eyes fixed on the auctioneer. There was a certain tension in the air, and as the bids increased, the tension grew. This was not a game or a joke. One could tell by the way one man would glance at another who had raised his bid, with only a smile on his lips and cold, bright eyes. Number 512 was sold for £110. The following 3 or 4 numbers were sold for approximately the same amount. The ship was rolling heavily, causing the wooden panels on the walls to creak as if they might split. The passengers held onto their chairs, focusing on the auction. The auctioneer called out low field and Mr. Bottyball sat up straight and tense. He planned to wait until the others finished bidding before making the final bid. He estimated that he had around $500 or possibly closer to $600 in his bank account back home, which was equivalent to over £200. He believed that this ticket wouldn't sell for more than that amount. The auctioneer explained that low field covered every number below 505. If anyone believed that the ship would travel less than 505 miles in the next 24 hours ending at noon tomorrow, they should bid on this number. The bidding went up to £130. Others, including Mr. Bottyball, seemed to have noticed the rough weather. The bidding reached £140, £150, and then stopped. The auctioneer raised his hammer, ready to sell it for £150. But then Mr. Bottyball called out £160, causing everyone in the room to turn and look at him. 70, exclaimed Mr. Bottyball. 80. Mr. Bottyball shouted. 90. 200. Mr. Bottyball continued. He had no intention of stopping now, no matter what. There was a moment of silence. Does anyone want to bid higher than £200? Stay calm, he told himself. Stay perfectly still and don't look up. It's bad luck to look up. Hold your breath. No one will raise the bid as long as you hold your breath. Going once for £200. The auctioneer, with his pink bald head covered in sweat, announced. Going. Gone. The hammer struck the table. Mr. Bottyball wrote a check and handed it to the auctioneer's assistant. Then, he settled back in his chair, waiting for the final tally. He couldn't go to bed without knowing how much he had won. After all the numbers were sold, they added it up. It came to over £2,000, which was around $6,000. 90% would go to the winner, and 10% to Seamen's charities. 90% of 6,000 was 5,400. Well, that was enough. He could buy the Lincoln convertible and still have some money left over. With this satisfying thought, he happily and excitedly went to his cabin. The next morning, when Mr. Bottyball woke up, he lay still in bed with his eyes closed, listening for the sound of the storm and waiting for the ship to rock. But there was no storm and the ship was steady. He leapt up and looked out of the small window on the ship. The sea, smooth as glass, was moving swiftly beneath the ship, making up for lost time during the night. Mr. Bottyball turned away and slowly sat on the edge of his bed. A strong sense of fear began to prickle in his stomach. He knew he had no chance now. It was almost certain that someone with a higher ticket number would win the pool after this. "Oh, my God," he said aloud. "What should I do?" He wondered what Ethel, his wife, would say. He couldn't possibly tell her that he had spent almost all of their savings on a ticket for the ship's pool. It was also impossible to keep it a secret. To do so, he would have to ask her to stop writing checks. And what about their monthly payments for the television and the Encyclopedia Britannica? He could already imagine the anger and contempt in her eyes, the blue turning grey and her eyes narrowing when she was angry. Oh, my God. What should I do? There was no point in pretending that he had any chance now, unless the ship miraculously started moving backwards. They would have to put the ship in reverse and go full speed astern, and even then, it would be unlikely for him to win. Perhaps he should ask the captain to do just that. He could offer him a percentage of the winnings, maybe even more if needed. Mr. Bottyball started to laugh nervously. Suddenly, he came to an abrupt halt, his eyes and mouth widening in a state of shock and surprise. It was in this very moment that a brilliant idea struck him. The impact was so strong that he leaped out of bed, filled with immense excitement. He rushed towards the porthole and peered outside. Why not? Why not indeed? The sea was calm, and he was confident he could stay afloat until they rescued him. Although he had a vague sense that someone had attempted this before, it didn't deter him from doing it again. The ship would have to halt and lower a boat, which would then have to travel back about half a mile to retrieve him before returning to the ship. The entire process would take approximately an hour, covering a distance of 30 miles. This would significantly reduce the ship's daily travel. With this plan, Lowfield would undoubtedly secure victory. He just needed to ensure that someone witnessed him falling overboard, but that could be easily arranged. It would be wise to wear lightweight clothing, something suitable for swimming, like sports attire. A shirt, shorts, and tennis shoes would be perfect. He decided to leave his watch behind. Glancing at the time, he realized it was 9:15. The sooner he acted, the better. He had to do it now and get it over with, as the deadline was midday. Mr. Bottyball felt a mix of fear and excitement as he stepped onto the sun deck wearing his sports clothes. His body was small but wide at the hips, tapering up to narrow sloping shoulders, resembling a bollard. He cautiously walked out on deck, his white skinny legs covered in black hair, wearing tennis shoes. He looked around and saw only one other person, an elderly woman with thick ankles and large buttocks, leaning over the rail and staring at the sea. She wore a coat made of Persian lamb with the collar turned up, hiding her face from Mr. Bottyball's view. He stood still, observing her from a distance, thinking she might be the one to raise the alarm if he were to jump off the ship into the ocean 1,000 miles away from land. However, he hesitated, reminding himself to take his time and remember what he had told himself earlier in the cabin. He considered the possibility that this woman might not give the alarm, perhaps because she was deaf and blind. While it was unlikely, he didn't want to take any chances. All he needed to do was verify it by having a brief conversation with her beforehand. Additionally, and this will illustrate how distrustful a person's mind can become when driven by self-preservation and fear, he had considered the possibility that the woman herself might be the owner of one of the high numbers in the lottery pool, and therefore have a strong financial motive to not want the ship to stop. Mr. Bottyball remembered that people had killed others for much less than $6,000, as reported in the newspapers every day. So why take a risk on that either? First, he needed to check on it. He needed to make sure of the facts. He needed to gather information through a polite conversation. Then, as long as the woman also seemed to be a pleasant and kind person, the plan would be a sure thing and he could jump overboard with a light heart. Mr. Bottyball casually approached the woman and positioned himself next to her, leaning on the railing. "Hello," he greeted her pleasantly. She turned and smiled at him, a surprisingly beautiful smile despite her plain face. "Hello," she replied. Verify, Mr. Bottyball reminded himself, on the first question. "She is neither blind nor deaf." "Tell me," he said, getting straight to the point, "what did you think of the auction last night?" "Auction?" she asked, furrowing her brow. "Auction? What auction?" "You know, that silly event they have in the lounge after dinner, where they sell numbers for the ship's daily journey," he clarified. "I was just curious to know your opinion on the matter," she said, shaking her head. Her smile was warm and friendly, with a hint of apology. "I'm quite lazy," she admitted. "I always go to bed early and even have my dinner there. It's so relaxing to eat in bed." Mr. Bottyball returned her smile and started to move away. "I need to go and do my exercise now," he explained. "I never miss my morning workout." "It was lovely to see you." "Very lovely." He took a few steps back, and the woman let him go without turning around. Everything was now in order. The sea was calm, he was dressed lightly for swimming, and there was likely no danger of man-eating sharks in this part of the Atlantic. Plus, there was this kind-hearted woman who could raise the alarm if needed. The only question was whether the ship would be delayed long enough to give him an advantage. Most likely, it would. Nevertheless, he could contribute a little to ensure that outcome. He could create some difficulties when they tried to rescue him and swim away discreetly. Every minute, every second he gained would increase his chances of winning. He started moving towards the rail again, but a new fear suddenly struck him. What if he got caught in the propeller? He had heard stories of people falling off big ships and suffering that fate. However, he had no intention of falling. Instead, he planned to jump. This distinction was important because if he jumped far enough, he would be able to clear the propeller. Mr. Bottyball slowly moved towards the rail, positioning himself about 20 yards away from the woman. She was no longer looking at him, which was a relief. He didn't want her to witness his jump. As long as no one was watching, he could later claim that he had slipped and fallen accidentally. He peered over the side of the ship and realized it was a significant distance to the water below. He considered the potential danger of hitting the water flat and remembered a story of someone splitting their stomach open from a belly flop. He knew he had to jump straight and land feet first, like a knife. The water appeared cold, deep, and gray, sending a shiver down his spine. However, he knew it was now or never. He encouraged himself to be brave and climbed onto the wide wooden top rail. Balancing for 3 terrifying seconds, he then leaped as far as he possibly could while shouting for help. The woman on the rail was startled by the first cry for help and jumped in surprise. She quickly glanced around and noticed a small man dressed in white shorts and tennis shoes flying through the air, spread-eagled and shouting. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of what action to take. Should she throw a lifebelt, run and raise the alarm, or simply shout? Stepping back from the railing, she turned to face the bridge, appearing motionless and undecided. However, her tension seemed to dissipate almost instantly, and she leaned forward, peering at the turbulent water in the ship's wake. Eventually, a small black head emerged from the foam, accompanied by a vigorously waving arm and a distant voice calling something indiscernible. The woman leaned even further over the rail, straining to keep sight of the bobbing speck, but it soon became too far away to confirm its presence. After some time, another woman emerged onto the deck. This second woman was thin and angular, wearing horn-rimmed spectacles. Spotting the first woman, she approached her with purposeful strides, resembling the deliberate gait of a spinster. "There you are," she exclaimed. The woman with the chubby ankles turned to look at her but remained silent. "I've been searching for you," the thin woman continued. "Searching everywhere." "It's quite peculiar," remarked the woman with the plump ankles. "Just a moment ago, a man jumped off the ship fully clothed." "Ridiculous." "Oh, it's true. He claimed he wanted to exercise and took a plunge without even bothering to undress." "You should come down immediately," the skinny woman insisted. Her expression turned stern, her entire face becoming sharp and attentive, and her tone lost its previous kindness. "And never wander around the deck alone like this again. You know very well that you're supposed to wait for me." "Yes, Maggie," replied the woman with the fat ankles, once again smiling, a tender and trusting smile. She took the other woman's hand and allowed herself to be guided away across the deck. "He was such a kind man," she remarked. "He even waved at me."